Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Generac GP7500e. This machine was dropped off by my friend Jason, who was actually selling another generator to a contractor. And when he was on his way out, the contractor asked Jason if he wanted his old generator. And of course, Jason said yes. So a couple hours later, he brought this by, dropped it off without a word. So, what's wrong with it? Your guess is as good as mine. Now, this machine, it does have an hour counter. I was really kind of curious how many hours that contractor put on here. Unfortunately, that no longer works. This is also electric start, which of course doesn't work either. So we have likely a dead battery. And I'm thinking we might want to replace that sooner than later because although this does have a pull start, I have pulled the engine over. It rotates fine, but the compression is really, really high. Almost like the compression release is broken. Maybe it's stuck, or if we're really lucky, it just needs a valve adjustment. So I think I'm going to start there. So let me get you set up a little bit better. We'll get this up on the lift and get going on it. I'm going to start actually by getting this battery swapped out. With the compression as high as it is, I think I'm going to do the easy thing and let the battery do the work. So I'm going to use this battery. It's obviously oversized to install it on the machine, but I don't want to get the right battery ordered up until we know if this is a viable machine. Let's see if the electric start works, and hopefully it can power through the compression. That's not good. Well, the good news is the electric start works, but it's having a really hard time turning the engine over, getting through that compression stroke. So I think the next move here is to actually check the compression, see where it's at. Before I do that, though, let's just check the oil. I probably should have done that before turning the engine over. And, I mean, there is some in there, but it's very low. I'd say it's about half of what should be in there. So usually I would just top this off and not do an oil change until the engine has run. But given that we're so low, I think we should just drain what's left and we'll fill it up with some new. I've measured out 1 liter of oil. Usually these engines take just over 1 liter. So once this is topped off, I'm going to take the used oil and put it in this container and see exactly how low we were. So the engine took 1.2 liters of oil. And yeah, we're way short of that. Looks like we got about 300, maybe 350 milliliters out of there. So we were down significantly on oil. Although we were low on oil, at least the oil looked good. There was no metallic in there. So that is a concern with these machines. They are known for having cams that fail, meaning the lobes get worn down. Now, it could still be an issue. I mean, potentially the oil's been changed recently and that metal was flushed out, but I kind of doubt it based on how little was in there. So we might have an oil burning problem, but being that this was used most likely 8 hours a day, it's not that unusual to run low on oil, even though you're not consuming that oil at an accelerated rate. Anyway, if the lobes were worn, that could explain the high compression. All right, the battery's reconnected. Now, normally on something like this with a compression release, we should see about 60 psi of compression, plus or minus about 10 psi. So between 50 and 70 psi is what we should get. In this case, I'm thinking we're going to be closer to maybe 125 to 150. All right, I think that's enough. I can tell we do have a problem. We're at 100 and about 25 psi. And I'm sure it would be higher if that starter could actually turn the engine over faster. So that is way too high. We definitely have an issue with the decompression system. So let's try to get this valve cover off and see what the valve clearance is like. The rockers do seem pretty loose. Now, I'm not sure what stroke I'm on, but the valves do look like they're up. So let's rotate the engine until one of the valves is open. So the exhaust is open. And yeah, there's some clearance on the intake. I wouldn't say it's excessive. Let's check the exhaust, because that is the one that the decompression system is driven off of. And clearance actually feels pretty good. I'll look up the specs on this engine in a minute. Usually the exhaust valve, it's 8 thousandths on these. And this one's actually tight at 8 thousandths. So yeah, I don't think it's a clearance issue. I think it's something inside that engine. 6 thousandths does not fit. So the valve's actually tight, which should lower the compression if the compression release was working. Yeah, 4 thousandths fits. It's actually pretty tight. So this valve is likely set at 3 thousandths. If anything, that gap should be increased, but that's only going to make the problem worse. So I think whatever's going on with this decompression system, it's not external. It's inside the engine. So I think we do need to open it up. Before I do, though, I kind of want to get this engine running if I can. And, well, that might be a challenge because this carb, I don't know what condition it's in. Obviously, it's going to be very hard to pull over. And like it is, could get hurt. So I think before I make a decision on what to do here, let's take a peek in the bowl. You know, this bolt right here will tell you a lot. If it's rusted and varnished, then you know the carb's in bad shape. In this case, it's not. The fuel that's coming out, though, that's a little different. That kind of looks like deck stain. So it hasn't not been running recently. And there's a good chance, actually, that carb, although not rusted out, might have some clogged jets. Another thing you can do, too, just to double check the decompression system, is just to pull the engine over slowly and follow which stroke it's on. So right now it's on the exhaust stroke. Now it's on the intake stroke. So when the intake valve closes, now we're on the compression stroke. And about halfway through, you should see this valve get bumped a tiny bit. And we're at top dead center now of the compression stroke. And that valve did not move at all. So for sure, either that decompression system is stuck or it's blown apart. I'm going to turn the engine over real quick without the spark plug in the engine, so there's no compression fighting us. I just want to make sure that starter is up to the task, because I've had engines before like this with high compression that could still turn over the engine just fine with the electric start. So I want to make sure 100% that the starter's good. Yeah, no issues with that starter. It's really tempting to try to start this machine, but given that the starter can't even do it, I think I'm going to pass. You know, if I try, likely I'm going to burn up that starter or just hurt myself trying to pull it over. So, you know, given what I've seen so far, I don't think there's any reason why this engine shouldn't run. You know, I guess I'd like to know for sure 100% that we don't have any other issues, either, you know, rod knock or the generator doesn't make power. But regardless, I would say it is worth the gamble. You know, to buy a new camshaft for this engine, Generac is selling them for $72, and I think it'll pay off. So I'm going to place that order, and while we wait for that to arrive, you know, I do want to get the engine opened up and prepped for reassembly. But before we can do that, we do need to get the generator uninstalled. Actually, I think I'm going to hold off ordering that part. You know, for all I know, this is an easy fix, and I really won't know that until I open up that engine and get a good look to see if the issue can be fixed reliably. Plus, I do have an extra camshaft. This is from a similar sized Honda clone, not exactly the same engine, but that is the good thing about Honda clones, is that the parts, they are fairly interchangeable. So there is a very good chance that this cam could be used if the one in there cannot be fixed. Going to start by getting this tin out of the way. This holds the governor spring, but it also directs the air over the head. I want to remove it because there's a couple bolts right here for the exhaust, and the exhaust has to be removed before we can get the stator and the rotor off. So I just marked these white wires with a dot just to put them back in the right spot. We also have another set of white wires. I mean, you know, technically it probably doesn't matter where they go as long as the colors are actually meaningful, which I'm assuming the white is the neutral, but it's not always safe to assume, so I want to put them exactly where they go. Anyway, to get the stator off, we're going to have to remove all these wires. So we're going to remove everything from the terminal block, remove the AVR, the brushes, and get this wire harness to the control panel out of the way. And I think while we're here, we'll run some quick tests on the stator and just check the health of it. You can usually tell by the wear on the brushes how many hours a machine has on it. Brushes, they do last a long time, and these brushes actually don't look worn any worse than most other machines I work on. So either someone replaced them at one point, or maybe this doesn't have quite as many hours on it as it could have. I actually picked up a pair of generators a few years back from a contractor, and those brushes were just worn completely down to the plastic. All right, let's start by checking leg 1. Now, usually these come in at around 0.3, 0.4 ohms. And in this case, we get nothing. So maybe leg 1 is these two wires, which it is. So we're at 0.2, 0.3. Seems good. We'll check that to ground. No connection to ground. Then we'll check leg 2. We should get pretty much the same reading. 0.3, 0.2. So that is good. Make sure there's no connection to ground, which would indicate a short circuit or an insulation failure, and there's not. So leg 1, leg 2 seem to be good. We already kind of double checked between leg 1 and leg 2 just to make sure, again, things aren't shorted out, and it's not. So things are looking pretty good there. So let's just check the rotor through the slip rings. These rotors, they usually come in between 40 and 70 ohms. And the readings, they are pretty high. So it's sometimes tricky because the slip rings, they do have carbon on them. And sometimes when these don't run for a while too, just a layer of corrosion kind of builds up as well. So, you know, the connection, it's high. So I'm going to get a little piece of Scotch-Brite on there, just clean up a spot. We'll try this again. All right, let's try this again. Cleaned up a little spot. Yeah, that is much better. 66 ohms. So that is within range. Check it to ground. No connection to ground. So the rotor is actually good. And then we just have this connector right here. This connects over to the AVR. We have the two blue wires. That is the DPE winding, which feeds power into the AVR. And the green and the white, that is the sense winding. That monitors the voltage output. and is usually connected to one of the main legs. So we'll start with the blue wires, which is the sense. Usually I see between 1.5 and 2.5 ohms, but that does vary a bit. So anywhere in that range is good. In this case, we're at 2 ohms, which is very good. Check it to ground. No connection to ground. Let's just check it to the other legs, make sure there's no short. And there's not, so the DPE seems to be good. Then we'll try the sense. And actually, we could try it between the two sense wires. Sometimes that shows as open, which might be concerning. In this case, I'm thinking that the sense is actually monitoring each leg, meaning one wire in each leg. And because we don't have the legs connected together, it's showing as open. So if I put this back in just to one of the sense wires and then check leg 1, we do have a good connection, and leg 2 I would expect we don't have a connection. But if I switch to the other wire, we do have a connection on leg 2. So the sense winding is actually monitoring the 240 out, not just one of the legs. So this generator, it tests well. So I don't think we're going to have any issues with that. Oh, that one's rusted on there. So I'm going to tighten down the top. See if we can crack that one on the bottom off. No. Oh, there we go. Yeah, sometimes you get lucky and they just come right off. In this case, I'm assuming it's going to put up a fight. The stator sometimes kind of gets stuck in that bell housing depending upon how much corrosion there is. And same thing with the ball bearing, which this side actually doesn't look too bad. So I'm thinking if we're going to have a problem, it's probably going to be on this side. So I'm going to try to use a puller to get the stator off. Now you'd want to go really easy on this. The bell housing doesn't have a lot of strength when pulling this way, so it's very easy to break it. Ask me how I know. Yep, it's coming off. Going to turn this bolt most of the way back in. We'll leave just maybe 1/8 of an inch, a couple millimeters, and we're going to hit that with a 3-pound hammer. If we're lucky, it'll shock it and allow the rotor to pop off that tapered shaft. If we're unlucky, we'll pretzel the bolt or miss completely and destroy the rotor. There we go. Yeah, we're just about home free. Only 2 nuts holding the engine onto the frame. That said, though, we can't quite remove it yet. We still have the wire harness connected to the engine, and somebody covered it in a bunch of duct tape. So we need to get that off in order to access the bullet connectors to disconnect the engine from the control panel. So I'm going to pick at that a bit, and also I'm going to take off the airbox. It actually is lower than the bottom of the engine block, and that's just going to cause issues once we get this off the frame. And they put a lot on. So I don't know if this is hiding something. Usually you don't need to do this. All right, it looks like we're in. So this is for the fuel solenoid. It is actually looped on itself. So someone did replace this carb at some point with one that came with the fuel solenoid, which, it's fine. You don't need it. The position is normally open. We have the low oil switch coming out to the module. That can stay. But we need to disconnect this wire, which runs over to the ignition coil. Looks like that bullet connector is not factory, so someone has definitely been in here, which I guess we already knew, given the amount of tape and zip ties. And that just about does it. We only have to remove these 2 wires from the positive terminal on the solenoid, and we should be free. This has got to be one of the most petrified fuel lines I've ever pulled off a machine. This thing is just rock solid, but very brittle. That cover broke free. A little bit too easy. Makes me wonder if someone's been in here. Looks nice and clean. No surprises. So I'm going to rotate the engine until the timing marks line up, and then we'll pull out the camshaft. It looks like this one is just stuck. It's fully intact. This weight right here should be up when the engine's not spinning. And instead it's locked down. You can see the spring tension. Supposed to pull it up, so I'm willing to bet if I bump it, it'll pop up. And I wouldn't say it feels very good. You can see it was hung up. It's actually moving pretty well now, so look at that. There's a piece of debris. So is that all it was? I think that was the problem. Not sure what it is, but now that that piece is out, it functions perfectly. So, yeah, pretty easy fix. This gasket, too, actually came off clean. So, you know, technically we could probably get away with reusing this. But I do have a new one, so let's get the old one off. We'll get a new gasket installed, get this reinstalled, and I think we'll be back in business. Gotta say, I like this gasket. They never come off this easy or as clean. Just taking that cover off. Usually, you know, half the gasket's on one side, half is on the other. But this gasket, definitely better than most. Just gonna get the lifters out of the way. The push rods are still in there too, so we're going to have to, I guess, be careful when putting the lifters back in. We're definitely going to have to reset the valves. They were off to begin with. I was just cleaning up the cover off camera and noticed something hiding under the governor. We have the source of contamination. This is the dipstick. And I didn't notice that when I checked and changed the oil. You know, a lot of times these don't have dipsticks, and they're really not needed on these Honda clones. I mean, you just fill the oil until it's at the last thread, and then you're full. There's really no reason for this. And in this case, this dipstick caused a lot of grief. Just going to take a second and spray down the cam in case there's any other bits hiding behind that weight. Nope, we're good. All right, let's start by getting the counterbalancer in. There's a timing mark right there that aligns to the mark here on the big gear. So we'll get that installed. And then we actually have to rotate the engine to get the timing mark for the camshaft on the right side of the engine. All right, that's good. Gonna use some assembly lube because it's real thick and it should hold the lifters in place long enough to get the camshaft installed. All right, perfect. We're in time. So I'm going to degrease this surface real quick. We'll throw the new gasket on, and we're ready to put this back together. So I took the push rods out when I installed the lifters because the weight of the push rods would just push the lifters down. So now that we have these loose, we can actually just probably remove this lock nut, back off this adjustment, and you want to make sure the push rod is in the lifter, which I don't think it is. Actually, it just dropped in. So we will get the rocker in place. And I'm going to just bring this down to 0 lash for now. And we'll do the same on the exhaust. Now make sure In this case, we have a rotator cap. The only thing that holds that in place is the rocker. So with the rocker not in place, that could fall out. And you don't want to lose that, because without it, the valve geometry is not going to be right. So to set the valve clearance, most manuals will say rotate the engine to top dead center or just a little bit past. What a lot of people don't realize is that the piston, though, is actually at the top twice. And what happens is, someone will put a straw down there or a screwdriver, and as soon as the piston comes up, they just set the valves. So, yeah, that results in a lot of mistakes. So what I tell people is just open one valve, set the other. You really can't go wrong that way. So we're going to set the exhaust. The manual does say it's 8 thousandths plus or minus a thousandth, and the intake is 6 thousandths plus or minus a thousandth. So right there, the 8 feels good. So I'm going to slowly snug up this lock nut. The clearance usually does decrease when you do this. So what I do is I tighten this up a bit, check the clearance, make adjustments, and then just keep snugging this up until everything's tight. Yeah, see, now it's tight. So we'll open that up a bit. That feels pretty good. So we'll snug it up just a bit more. And it's pretty tight. I'd say it's likely a 7, which is fine, but let's try to open that up a bit. There we go. And the 8 is tight. Let's make sure it's at least a 7. Yeah, 7 fits fine. So we're in spec. Actually, the 8 doesn't feel that bad either. So the exhaust valve is good. Let's rotate the engine and set the intake. And that's perfect. We're right at 6 thousandths. So I'm going to put the compression tester back in, and hopefully we see something close to 60 psi. So what do you think? Is the compression release going to work? I think the answer to that is going to be yes. But the question is, what is the compression? Ideally it would be at 60 psi, but anywhere between 50 and 70, the engine should be easy to pull over, and it should start without much issue. Beautiful. And we are exactly at 50 psi. So compression release, definitely working. That is a very big difference from what we got before. And this time, very easy to pull over. So this engine absolutely should start without issue. So I'm going to get some oil in it now before I do something stupid and try to start it. cut the rest of that nub off. Who would have thought a piece of plastic would have done that? You know, if anything, would have just thought the engine would chew it up. You know, what are the odds that it got jammed where it did? Got a new gasket for the valve cover. The old one wasn't looking so hot. All right, so let's get this harness reconnected. We'll start with the red wire, which runs over to the battery. So it sends power to this post, which is full-time battery positive. We have this wire here, which goes to the electric start. So the starter actually always has a positive connected right to it. It is switched using the ground wire. So we'll get this on that post to send positive, and then we have this one here coming from the control panel. This is the charge wire, which surprisingly this generator does not charge its own battery, at least not with the generator. There is a plug on the control panel. You're supposed to plug it in to the wall when you're not using it for about 12 hours a month to keep the battery topped off. All right, so that is all done. We have also these two wires coming down from the control panel. We have this one, which comes through the low oil module, and this one runs over to the coil. So the way this works is when you get a low oil situation, it should ground out the coil. You know, in this case, it's going to send that ground up to the control panel. And then this wire coming down from the control panel will send that ground back if there's low oil, or if you turn the switch to the off position. And that's it. So the engine harness is done. Let's move on. Yeah, I'm getting pretty excited to hear this thing run. You know, I'm tempted just to clean the carb real quick, throw it on, put the rest together, but you know, the condition of the exhaust and the stator isn't that good. There's just a bunch of rust, and there's really not going to be a better time than now to, you know, clean this up and get a fresh coat of paint on it. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that there's a very low probability of getting these bolts off. So I'm going to actually start with one of the ones on the back. We'll apply some heat to it, a bit of penetrating oil, and see if we can get that one out. You know, if they come out, then I'll keep going. If not, then I think I'm going to put the brakes on it and just settle for refinishing the heat shield and not completely break every bolt on this exhaust system. Yeah, I'm just going to use the small impact on medium. Any higher, and it'll just twist that bolt right off in two pieces. Okay, there's one. All right, so while we wait for that paint to dry, let's open up this carb and clean it up. Fuel solenoid seems to be in good shape. Yeah, not bad actually. Some bad fuel in the bottom, a tiny bit of debris, but overall, very good. I can tell the main jet is not clogged, so, this carb probably would have ran the engine as is. But let's just take it completely apart. We'll go through everything real quick, and that way we know we're good for the first start. Pilot jet might be clogged. Take a closer look at that in a minute. Then we got the main jet and the emulsion tube down the middle, so let's try to get those out. Yeah, everything in here actually looks almost brand new, so I'm kind of wondering, how long this carb was on. I mean, clearly it's seen a bit of weather, but the inside looks great, and we know this was not the original carb, so potentially, it was swapped out when they started having trouble starting it. And judging by the fuel color, that was, I'd say, at least 2 or 3 years ago. Pilot jet was not clogged. Neither is the main jet. I almost forgot, this one has a pilot needle. Most do have it, but a lot of them, the needle is actually broken off once it's set at the factory. This one is removable, and it controls the amount of fuel that comes out of that little hole right there in front of the throttle plate. So that is always supplying fuel and really comes into play when you're idling. In this case, the generator doesn't idle, but it does always contribute fuel. And there's a couple more holes actually further in, right kind of behind the throttle plate. So once it starts to open just a little bit, it starts exposing those other holes, which is also part of the pilot circuit. So the jet that's right there meters not only this one up front, but the other, looks like 3 in this case, a little bit further back. So let's see where this is set at before we remove it. There's 1, 2, 3. About 3 1/4. So that seems a little bit far out. So I think when I put it back together, I'll set it at 2. And we can always back it out if that ends up being a little bit too lean. cleaned up pretty well. Not that it was too dirty to begin with. I mean, the outside still doesn't look great. You know, that's not dirt, that's just corrosion, so we're not going to be able to fix that. So let's get the needle and the float back in. It's kind of interesting too. The needle setup on this one, it's more of a Mikuni clone than a Honda clone. You know, not that it matters that much, but it's interesting how manufacturers kind of mix and match, you know, some of the designs from the different carbs. All right, that looks good. Get the emulsion tube in the main jet. All right. And we'll just put the bowl on and finish it up with the pilot jet. There we go. Just turn it in until about 1 or 2 threads poke through, like that. You know, this generator doesn't idle, so you don't want to drive that too far in, or else the engine could run fast without a load. All right, we're bottomed out right there, so we'll do half 1, half 2. And last but not least, we have the fuel solenoid, which isn't used, or at least is not energized, but in this case you do need it to plug the hole in the bottom of the bowl. All right, that should do. All right, it's the next day. Everything is dry to the touch and came out pretty well. You never know how bad it was. Even painted up the hardware to hold that heat shield in place. And the stator came out really nice. So at this point, I think we can put it back together and try it out. Yeah, the rotor needs to be torqued down to 30 foot-pounds, but you know, as it is right now, you can't do that because the crankshaft is not locked up. So there's a few ways you can lock it up, but I find the easiest way is just to pull off the starter recoil. You know, put a big wrench on there that will hold things still, and then we can torque down to 30 foot-pounds. I'm going to take a second and clean up these slip rings. As we saw earlier, it was hard to measure the resistance of the rotor through these slip rings. So I'm just going to use a piece of Scotch-Brite to clean it up, and then we should be ready to get the stator on. So now that everything's torqued down, you definitely want to rotate the engine at least one full revolution. Make sure the engine doesn't bind up and that you don't hear any scraping down in the generator head. And in this case, we're good. The alignment seems to be fine. So let's finish this up. We'll get the wires connected, the exhaust on, the carburetor, and then we'll try to start it. I was just thinking Generac did a good job with these ring terminals. You know, the insulation isn't too far down. And then I looked at the ones on the Stator, and pretty much every single one of them, you know, the insulation's coming down way too far. So it's actually going to get clamped, you know, between the conductors. And of course, that's an insulator. You don't want that where it is. So I need to cut all that back a bit before reassembling this. And last but not least, we want to secure this wire right here because this is long enough that it could get sucked in. And I've seen it before. It'll completely destroy the generator if that happens. The plug that came out of there, it's an NGK BPR5ES. You know, the plug actually looks pretty good. I don't think it's seen a lot of use. So, you know, likely I can reuse the plug, but I do have a bunch of new ones hanging around. It's a BPR5ES, just like the one that came out of there. So I think I'm going to treat this one to a new plug. Now, you should double check it. The gap should be about 30 thousandths. And in this case, we're a little bit tight. It's about 25 thousandths. So I'm going to open that up just a little bit. Yeah, a little bit more. we go. Just going to leave the airbox off for now until we validate that everything's good with this carburetor. And last but not least, we have to resecure this tin up here. You know, A, to keep it cool so the air gets directed over the head, but also to add some spring tension. Right now there's no spring tension, and without any tension, all this is going to do is idle. So let's get this back in place. And I am going to back off the tension anyway, just a bit for the first start. Of course it's stuck. It's surprising because it's not very rusty. Let's try the impact. There we go. It's taking a lot of fuel. I think that needle might be stuck. Which isn't too uncommon when you put these back together. Sometimes they do stick, although it is slowing down. So I think we're ready for contact. All right, let's give this a try. The ignition's turned on. I've also got a light plugged in and turned on, and the kilowatt on standby. The choke is on. Well, not too bad. It started first pull. The engine sounded great, and we have power. Now, the engine speed, it was slow, so I'm going to bring that up a bit before trying it again. And the engine, it did stall out once I turned that choke off. You know, I was going to restart it, but I couldn't help but notice a bunch of debris flying out, including what looks to be like an acorn right there. So we definitely have a critter nest in that blower housing. So I'm going to take it off real quick, just clean it out, and we'll try this again. I'm just going to get this handle out of the way. I've already loosened up the bolt, and it's been kind of in the way. So we don't need it for now. It's not too bad. There was a little something in there, but I think most of it kind of blew out once this engine started. So we'll just clean this up a bit. You know, I can see there is some debris kind of packed in there, and a little bit right there too. So we'll clean that out, put this back together, and give it another try. I think we might have just ran out of fuel real quick, so I added a much longer fuel line. So this time it'll run hopefully longer. And I'm going to increase that tension a little bit on that spring before we restart it. And if it runs long enough, we'll try to dial it in a little bit closer to where it should be without a load at 61.5 hertz. All right, let's try this again. I did increase the spring tension a little bit. I guess the other possibility too is that we're losing spark, because it was a pretty abrupt shutdown. Like, it was running perfect and then nothing. So the ignition's on, choke is already on. Well, like last time, it started the first pull, but I couldn't turn the choke off. When I do that, it starts to run lean and goes to stall. So I left the choke partially on. I brought that engine speed up closer to 61.5 hertz. And then I tried backing this needle out to let a little bit more fuel into the pilot system. And that made no difference, because when I opened the choke fully, the engine stalled out. So at this point, we're 3 turns out. I'm thinking that is too far. That is certainly a vacuum leak. It could be contributing to what's going on here. So I'm going to bring this all the way in, back it out 1 turn, and we'll try this one last time. It's surprising, actually, that the pilot system's having trouble, because it starts first pull. And if the pilot system was clogged up, I think it would take quite a few more pulls. So let's try that. We're now 1 turn out, and if it was a vacuum leak right there, then this should run quite a bit better. And unfortunately, setting that to 1 turn out didn't fix the issue here. So, I could pull this carb off, clean it again, although it was pretty clean to begin with, and it's been cleaned once, and it's running lean. So, potentially we could find the issue. I think just adding the airbox will richen it up some, but I don't think it's going to richen it up enough to fix this issue. So rather than fighting with that one, I do have plenty of Honda clone carburetors. Now, some of these are not in good condition, but some of them are. You know, this one is missing the choke plate. We stole that for another machine, so, you know, that one I know ran well, but we'd have to make it complete. We also have one here that runs well, but needs the pilot O-ring. So I think I'll make this one complete. This one also doesn't have the fuel solenoid, which that machine doesn't need. So yeah, let's bolt this one on, see if it's any better. I replaced the O-ring on the pilot jet, and I was getting ready to bolt this on, and then I realized this one also missing the choke plate. So although I know this one works well, you know, it's not really a good candidate. So instead, I'm going to use this one. It's not labeled. I'm not sure if I tried it or if it just came off a blown up engine, but I did take a peek inside and it seems to be clean. So let's give this one a try. So I got the car bolted on and full of fuel. Needle and seat seem to be holding just fine. So let's turn the choke on, pull the engine over, and hopefully this time we'll get a different result when we turn the choke off. That was a pretty big difference. Could turn the choke off right away. So now that we know we can keep this carb, I'm going to swap out this choke lever. I think the yellow lever I typically see on Honeywells, but it kind of clashes with the Generac orange. So we'll set that out of the way and just put a standard black one in its place. The original airbox, it's pretty rusted and faded. There's nothing wrong with it though. It could be used, but I do have a plastic one that's in good condition. I think the only concern is, is it going to fit between the car body and the frame rail? We're also missing the metal screen right here, which helps keep the filter away from the carburetor. That said, it's missing on a lot of machines and I've never seen it cause a problem. So I think we'll be okay. Just going to leave it loose for now. Let's see if this fits. And yeah, it does. Yeah, the filter's not in great shape, so I had this other one which wasn't quite the right size, but I did cut it up. And it seems to be a good fit now. So we'll just oil it. And then it should be good to go. So Jason has the tank for this. He says it's in good shape, but for whatever reason, it did not come with the side rail. Luckily, I've had a couple GP7500 parts machines in the last year or so, and I think this should solve the problem. All right, so let's get the engine started. We'll let it warm up a bit. While it's doing that, we'll just double check the voltage in the hertz. And then we're going to put on a half load of about 3,500 watts. We'll see how it does. We'll double check the power quality and what the sine wave looks like. And then we'll go for the max of 7,500 watts, see if the engine's up to the task. All right, started without issue. Engine seems to be running fine. Without a load, we're at about 6.6% THD. And the sine wave, yeah, it doesn't look great, but I've seen a lot worse. So let's bring on a half load of 3,500 watts, starting with 2,000, add another 1,000, another 500. So we're at 3,500 watts. THD jumped quite a bit to 20.3. The sine wave did clean up a bit, but still doesn't look great. All right, so far so good. 3,500 watts, holding without issue. So let's swap out some of this. We'll turn off the 1,000 and the 500. We'll put on another 2,000. That'll bring us up to 4,000. 6,000. 7,000. 7,500. It's doing it. We're at 23.5. Oh, we're losing speed. So it did not like that. It was close though. Let's try 7,000. We seem to be steady. So we're at 23% THD. Sine wave looks unchanged. So let's give this a couple minutes, then we'll try 7,500 watts again. That's been holding pretty steady for a few minutes at about 59.5 hertz under a 7,000 watt load. Now, the voltage, just about 120 volts, so that is perfect. Let's try adding that 500 back. Keep an eye on that meter. Nope. Can't do 7,500 watts. Peaks out at about 7,000 watts. So let's take the load off. We'll let the engine cool down a bit. Actually, I'm going to try this one more time because I just realized that light is 70 watts. So technically, we're putting over the rated load and the engine's going to stall. So could turning that 70 watt load off make the difference? Let's find out. So we'll bring it back up to 6,000 watts. $7,000. We're holding at 60 hertz. Let's double check the kilowatt, 59.7.6. Let's add on that last 500. Nope. Can't do it. overall, not too bad, but a little disappointing on the max load test. These typically can pull 7,500 watts, and in this case, we fell just a little bit short. It could pull 7,000 watts without issue. Once you factor in the 70 watts from the light and probably another 100 watts from the fans and the load bank, we were pulling 7,200 watts without issue. But that last little bit, that last 300 watts, it just couldn't do. So we were missing a tiny bit of horsepower from this engine. Where that loss is, your guess is as good as mine. We could chase that and maybe never figure it out. And quite honestly, it's splitting hairs. We are very close. And if you need 7,500 watts, you shouldn't be buying a 7,500 watt machine, because if anything is not perfect, then you're not going to get the rated load. And even if you do, you're going to be pushing the engine and the generator to their max capability, and you're going to shorten the life of each of those things. So, in the end, we made out pretty well on this. I went into it assuming I'd have to buy a new camshaft, and as it turns out, it was just a piece of plastic jammed in that decompression system. So once we got it out of the way, things went back to normal, and now this machine is back up and running again. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.